The story of how my family came to be in El Paso, Texas, starts back in 1818 when Henry Bagnall, my great-great-grandfather, was born to Charles Bagnall and his wife, Anne Percival. Sadly, when Henry was around 3 years old, his mother, Anne, had postpartum depression after giving birth to her fourth child, and she ended up committing suicide. The children's father could not care for them for unknown reasons, so their good friends and Anne's sister, Phoebe Percival, and her husband William Cartwright took the children in. After a couple of years, all of the children except for Henry went back to living with their biological father. It is unknown why Henry stayed with Phoebe and William, but Henry lived a happy life with his adopted family. His father, William Cartwright, was a jeweler in Salford, England, and Henry grew up learning the trade with his father there. Sadly, though, in 1865, William died of cancer. 4 years after his father's death, Henry took steps to get his name changed to Cartwright. Now, during this time in England, there were many factors that made people immigrate from their home country. In England, the people were experiencing agricultural depressions that were affecting the whole country. The economy was in terrible shape, so there were not many jobs, and even the few jobs there were starting to get shut down. Another issue that was happening that was causing immigration was an increase in taxes enacted by the Parliament. The taxes were raised to the point where many of the small farmers could not afford to pay them and keep their families provided for. Sadly, during these times, Parliament had also enacted 2 new laws that prohibited people from moving out of the country. It also made it to where if anyone was caught trying to convince people to leave England, they were charged with a fine and were put in jail for up to 12 months until the fine was paid. Luckily, both of the acts were repealed in 1824, but until they were, it left many people stuck in England with no jobs. But about 20 years later, between 1846 and 1854, there was a huge influx of immigrants to the United States because there was an influx of technological advances in England that left many people out of their jobs. This hurt the English economy very badly, and many people left the United States or other countries in search of work. Sadly, because of the way that the economy was headed in England, after Henry's mother Phoebe died, their family jewelry shop was sold. Now, Henry was already married to a woman named Emma Louise Porritt, and they had 5 children. Henry could not find a way to support his family while staying in England, so he packed them up and moved to the United States. The next record that is found of Henry shows that he was an established jeweler in Danville, Kentucky. No one in the family is sure why he chose Kentucky as a place to settle down. One of Henry's sons, Thomas William Cartwright, also known as Will, my great-grandfather, was around 14 years old when his father moved their family to America. He followed in his father's footsteps and learned the trade of jeweler from his father, just like his dad did with his grandfather. But after a while, he ended up getting a job with the L&N Railroad as a conductor. While he was working for the railroads, he got married to Elizabeth Till and had 2 children with her. A couple of years into their marriage, they decided that they did not want to be married anymore, and Will left his family in Kentucky and went with the railroads to El Paso, Texas around 1914. On his way to El Paso, he was not conducting the train, but was a passenger when some train robbers stopped the train he was on and robbed everyone on it. They took everyone's money and jewelry, so they all arrived in El Paso with nothing. Luckily, my great-grandfather had a job with the railroad that he was on, because the robbers did not take everything from him like they did with the other travelers on the train. Most of them did not have jobs or family waiting for them in El Paso like my great-grandfather did. An interesting story that is passed down through my family about Will Cartwright was one day when he was conducting a train. Will was going through the train at a stop to make sure everything was okay with the passengers and the cargo. While he was doing that, he came upon a Winchester rifle that was in one of the cargo holds. Will assumed it was from someone who was trying to jump on the train, threw his rifle in, and didn't end up making it onto the train himself. My great-grandfather kept the rifle and passed it down to his son, who was my grandfather, and he still has the gun sitting on a shelf in his house today. Now, after Will arrived in El Paso, he continued his work with the railroad company and ended up meeting a woman named Mercedes Flores. They got married in 1929 when Will was 60 years old. They had 4 children together, the youngest of which was born when Will was 70 years old. The youngest child was Thomas Cartwright, my grandfather. Thomas Cartwright was born in 1940 in El Paso, Texas. He He grew up with his mother, father, and 3 sisters. He started working as a health inspector, going around restaurants in El Paso making sure they were up to code. Eventually, he ended up getting a job working at El Paso Natural Gas. While he was working there, he met a young woman named Elizabeth Wright. He married Elizabeth, who already had 1 child from a previous marriage and had 2 children. After having their 2 children, Elizabeth and Thomas ended up adopting 2 more children from Elizabeth's nephew. Her nephew and his wife were drug and alcohol addicts, and they would leave their 2 daughters with Elizabeth and Thomas for long periods of time. Finally, Elizabeth decided that they needed to just get custody of the girls. They went through years of court and finally got full custody of the children. But about a year into the custody battles with her nephew, Elizabeth and Thomas had the girls living with them. Elizabeth's nephew and his wife decided they wanted the children back, even though they knew the courts wouldn't give them the kids. So one day, they broke into Elizabeth and Thomas's house. Elizabeth grabbed the youngest child, who was a little over a year old, and locked themselves in a bathroom. The older daughter tried to hide under her bed, but the nephew and his wife found her and kidnapped her. The police couldn't find her for almost a year, so Elizabeth finally wrote a letter to the governor of Texas, Dolph Briscoe Jr., asking for help. Luckily for her, the governor's wife saw her letter and took it to her husband and told him he had to do something to help my grandmother find her daughter. After being pushed by his wife, the governor got the Texas Rangers involved on the case, and they eventually found the daughter and returned her to Elizabeth. The youngest of the 2 adopted girls is my mother, Shauna. Shauna grew up here in El Paso, and at the age of 16 met my father, Corey, who was a Marine stationed here. They actually met in a club in Juarez. Soon she got pregnant and the 2 got married. They ended up stationed in North Carolina, but Corey was sent off to the Gulf War. So Shauna went back to El Paso to live with her parents until the baby was born, and Corey came back from war. After Corey came back, Shauna went back to North Carolina, and they had their 2nd child, me. Soon after I was born, they got a divorce and Shauna moved back to El Paso. While living here in El Paso, she met a man named James Lofton, and they started dating. She soon found out she was pregnant from a short-lived relationship she had been in before she met James. Our brother was born, and about 5 years later, James and Shauna got married. They were living in Las Vegas, Nevada at the time, but James's stepmother offered him a job in her family business back in El Paso, so the family moved back and stayed there for almost 11 years. Then some bad things happened with the family business and it was shut down, so the family moved to Georgetown, Texas, which is right outside of Austin. After living there for about 3 years, I was old enough to start college, and I moved back here to El Paso to attend the University of Texas at El Paso. Elizabeth and Thomas ended up leaving El Paso about 10 years ago, and they moved to Georgetown, Texas. Their other children have since left El Paso as well, and now live in California, Dallas, Austin, and Houston.